He could have escaped. He stayed. That was the decision Honorary Captain John Weir Foote made on August 19, 1942, as the last landing craft prepared to leave the hell of Dieppe Beach. He had spent 8 hours carrying wounded men across open ground under murderous German fire. He had saved dozens of lives, dragging men from the exposed beach to the temporary shelter of the regimental aid post. Now the evacuation was ending. The raid was over, and Foote had multiple chances to board a landing craft and escape. But Foote looked at the wounded men who could not be moved, looked at the soldiers being taken prisoner, and he made his choice. He climbed out of the landing craft and walked back into German captivity. This is the story of compassion in the midst of catastrophe, the story of a chaplain who refused to abandon his men even when salvation was within reach. The story of a man who chose 3 years in a prison camp over leaving wounded soldiers behind. And the story of why John Weir Foote became the only Canadian chaplain ever awarded the Victoria Cross. August 19, 1942, 05:20 hours, White Beach, Dieppe, France. The landing craft carrying the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry ground onto the shingle beach in front of the French coastal town. The ramps dropped and Canadian soldiers poured out into what one survivor would later describe as an inferno. German machine guns positioned on the cliffs and in the beachfront casino opened fire immediately. Mortar shells crashed down on the beach, artillery fire screamed in from the headlands, and men began falling before they reached the shingle. Among the soldiers coming ashore was Honorary Captain John Weir Foote, the regimental chaplain of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry. Foote was 38 years old, 6 feet 3 inches tall and powerfully built. He was not supposed to be on this beach at all. Chaplains were not required to accompany troops on raids. But Foote had insisted on going, arguing that where his men went, he went. Now he was running across the beach with bullets kicking up the shingle all around him. The Dieppe raid was already turning into one of the worst disasters in Canadian military history. Operation Jubilee was supposed to be a large-scale raid on the German-occupied French port of Dieppe. The plan called for nearly 5,000 Canadian soldiers to land on the beaches, capture the port, hold it for several hours, and then withdraw. The raid was intended to test amphibious assault tactics, boost Allied morale, and demonstrate Britain's commitment to opening a second front. But almost everything that could go wrong did go wrong. The element of surprise was lost when the invasion fleet accidentally encountered a German coastal convoy. The Germans were fully alerted by the time the Canadians hit the beaches at dawn. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, known as the Rileys, was assigned to capture White Beach on the western side of Dieppe's main esplanade. The beach was dominated by a large casino building that the Germans had fortified into a strongpoint. Machine gun positions covered every approach, and German artillery on the surrounding cliffs had perfect fields of fire. The Calgary Regiment's Churchill tanks were supposed to land with the infantry to provide armored support, but the tanks arrived 10 to 15 minutes late, leaving the infantry exposed during the critical first minutes of the assault. When the tanks finally did arrive, most became stuck in the deep shingle, or were stopped by the seawall. Of the 582 men from the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry who landed at Dieppe, more than 360 would become casualties. 63% killed, wounded, or captured. And in the middle of this carnage walked Honorary Captain John Weir Foote. John Weir Foote had been born in Maddock, Ontario, Canada, on May 5, 1904. His father was Gordon Benjamin Weir Foote, and his mother was Helena Foote. John grew up in the small eastern Ontario town of Maddock, receiving his early education in local schools. After high school, John worked briefly for his father-in-law in a hardware business. But John felt called to a different path, called to serve God and his community. John decided to enter the Presbyterian ministry and began his theological education. He attended the University of Western Ontario in London, studying general arts and humanities. He then continued his education at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Finally, John enrolled at Presbyterian College and McGill University in Montreal, Quebec. Presbyterian College was affiliated with McGill and provided theological training for Presbyterian ministers. John graduated from Presbyterian Theological College in 1934 with his theology degree. He was ordained as a Presbyterian minister and began his pastoral work. In 1929, before completing his theological studies, John married Edith Geraldine Sheridan. Edith had been born in 1898 and was 6 years older than John. Their marriage would last until Edith's death in 1986, 57 years together. After ordination in 1934, John Foote served as minister to Presbyterian congregations in 2 communities. His first posting was to Fort Coulonge, Quebec, a small lumber town on the Ottawa River. John later moved to Port Hope, Ontario, a town on the north shore of Lake Ontario. In both communities, John was known as a dedicated minister who cared deeply about his parishioners. He was tall and physically imposing, but also gentle and compassionate. In 1934, John also joined the Loyal Orange Association. He was initiated into Fraserville Loyal Orange Lodge No. 46 in Ontario. The Orange Order was a Protestant fraternal organization with strong roots in Canada's Scottish and Irish communities. When World War II broke out in September 1939, John was 35 years old and serving in Port Hope. Canada declared war on Germany on September 10, 1939. Young men across the country began enlisting in the armed forces. John Foote felt the call to serve, to minister to soldiers who would be facing the horrors of war. In December 1939, just 3 months after the war began, John enlisted in the Canadian chaplain service. Military chaplains held honorary rank. They wore uniforms and lived with the soldiers, but were non-combatants. John was commissioned as an honorary captain and assigned to the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry. The RHLI, nicknamed the Rileys, was an infantry regiment based in Hamilton, Ontario. The regiment traced its history back to 1862 and had fought in the South African War and World War I. John became the regimental chaplain, responsible for the spiritual welfare of over 600 soldiers. In July 1940, the 1st Battalion, Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, sailed to England. Honorary Captain John Foote went with them, beginning 2 years of training and waiting in Britain. The Rileys were part of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, stationed in southeastern England. Canadian troops had been in Britain since December 1939, defending against possible German invasion. But by spring 1942, the Canadians had been training for over 2 years without seeing combat. The troops were growing restless, morale was declining, and there was pressure from Ottawa to get Canadian soldiers into action. British planners were developing Operation Rudder, a large-scale raid on the French port of Dieppe. When the operation was offered to Canadian commanders, they eagerly accepted. Operation Rudder was scheduled for early July 1942, but was postponed due to bad weather. The operation was then revived as Operation Jubilee, with the same target and similar plan. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division would provide the main assault force for the raid on Dieppe. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry was assigned to White Beach on the right side of Dieppe's main promenade. As regimental chaplain, John Foote was not required to accompany the raiders. Chaplains were non-combatants under the Geneva Convention and typically did not go on offensive operations. But John Foote insisted on going with his men. His superior officers tried to dissuade him, explaining the extreme danger of the operation. But Foote was adamant where his regiment went, he would go. On the evening of August 18, 1942, the invasion fleet assembled at 4 ports along England's south coast. 237 ships and landing craft carrying over 6,000 troops sailed for France. Nearly 5,000 of those troops were Canadian, with the remainder being British commandos and a small contingent of American Rangers. John Foote boarded the landing ship HMS Glengyle with the men of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry. Before the ship sailed, Foote gathered the soldiers together for prayer. He led them in reciting Psalm 27, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" The fleet crossed the English Channel during the night, arriving off the French coast around 3 in the morning. At 0300 hours on August 19th, the troops began transferring from the larger ships into assault landing craft. The small landing craft would carry them the final distance to the beaches. But before the main assault began, disaster struck on the eastern flank. A group of landing craft carrying No. 3 Commando ran into a German coastal convoy. A brief naval battle erupted, with gunfire and explosions shattering the pre-dawn darkness. The Germans immediately radioed warnings to their coastal defenses, alerting all units that an attack was imminent. The element of surprise crucial to the raid's success was completely lost. At 05:15, RAF Hurricane squadrons began bombing German coastal defenses. Smoke screens were laid to protect the approaching landing craft. At 05:20, the first assault waves hit the beaches in front of Dieppe. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry landed on White Beach, directly opposite the large beachfront casino. The Essex Scottish Regiment landed on Red Beach to the left. The German defenders were fully alert and waiting. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry's landing craft ground onto the shingle beach under heavy fire. Machine guns positioned in the casino and on the cliffs opened up immediately. Mortar rounds crashed down onto the beach, and artillery fire pounded the landing craft. Soldiers dropped as soon as they came off the ramps, cut down by machine gun fire. Others stumbled across the shingle, weighed down by equipment trying to reach cover. The beach was covered with large rounded stones that made movement difficult. Barbed wire obstacles blocked the approaches to the seawall. Honorary Captain John Foote came ashore with the assault wave. He wore his chaplain's uniform with its distinctive cross insignia. Under the Geneva Convention, chaplains were protected non-combatants who were not supposed to be targeted. But in the chaos of the Dieppe beach, nobody was safe from the German fire. Foote ran across the beach to where the regimental medical officer had established the regimental aid post. The aid post was set up in a slight depression on the beach, barely enough to provide cover for men lying down. Captain Clare, the regimental medical officer, was already treating wounded soldiers. Foote immediately began assisting, applying bandages and helping to move the wounded. But the depression was too small to hold all the casualties. Wounded men were lying all across the exposed beach crying out for help. John Foote looked at the fire-swept beach, looked at the wounded soldiers, and made his decision. He stood up and walked out onto the open beach. Machine gun fire swept across the shingle, bullets kicking up stones all around Foote as he moved. Mortar shells exploded on the beach, sending shrapnel screaming through the air. But Foote kept walking, moving from one wounded man to another. When Foote reached a wounded soldier, he would kneel beside him despite the fire. He carried morphine syrettes to inject into wounded men to ease their pain. He applied first aid, bandaging wounds to stop bleeding. Then, using his powerful build, Foote would lift the wounded man onto his shoulders. Carrying men who weighed 150 pounds or more, Foote would walk back across the exposed beach to the aid post. Soldiers watching from whatever cover they could find were amazed by what they were seeing. The tall chaplain was walking calmly across a beach swept by machine gun fire. He showed no fear, no hesitation, just focused determination to save the wounded. Survivors later said it seemed impossible that Foote was not hit. Bullets were striking all around him. Men were dying on every side, but Foote kept moving. After delivering a wounded man to the aid post, Foote would turn around and walk back out onto the beach. Again and again he repeated this journey across the fire-swept shingle. Some wounded men were too badly injured to be moved immediately. Foote would stay with them on the open beach, administering morphine and offering words of comfort. He would pray with dying men, holding their hands as life left them. Meanwhile, the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry was fighting desperately to accomplish its mission. Small groups of soldiers managed to reach the casino building and fight their way inside. They cleared the lower floors in brutal room-to-room fighting against German defenders. Some Rileys even managed to cross the esplanade and enter the town of Dieppe itself. But they were too few in number and without supporting armor. The Churchill tanks from the Calgary Regiment were supposed to support the infantry assault. But the tanks arrived 10 to 15 minutes late, a delay that proved catastrophic. When the tanks finally did land, they immediately encountered problems. The deep shingle beach caused many tanks to bog down, their tracks spinning uselessly. Some tanks managed to cross the beach and reach the seawall that separated the beach from the esplanade. But they found concrete obstacles blocking the narrow streets leading into town. Without combat engineers to clear these obstacles, the tanks could not advance. The tanks that had made it over the seawall began firing at German positions. One tank even climbed the steps of the casino and poured fire through the windows. But German anti-tank guns began destroying the immobilized tanks one by one. By mid-morning, All 29 tanks that had made it to shore were either destroyed or abandoned. The raid was turning into a disaster on every beach. On Red Beach to the left, the Essex Scottish Regiment had suffered even worse casualties than the Rileys. Within 20 minutes of landing, 75% of the Essex Scottish were killed or wounded. At Puys to the east, the Royal Regiment of Canada landed late on a beach overlooked by cliffs. German machine gunners on the cliff tops cut down the Royals as they came ashore. Of the 554 men who landed at Puys, only 33 made it back to England. At Pourville to the west, the South Saskatchewan Regiment and Cameron Highlanders had initial success, but they were eventually forced back to the beach and suffered heavy casualties during the withdrawal. By 8 o'clock in the morning, it was clear the raid had failed, but Major General John Hamilton Roberts, commanding the operation from HMS Calpe offshore, did not have accurate information. Radio communications from the beach were confused and contradictory. Roberts believed incorrectly that substantial numbers of troops had penetrated into Dieppe. At 7 o'clock, he committed his reserve unit, Les Fusiliers Mont-Royal, from Montreal. The Fusiliers landed directly in front of Dieppe into the heaviest German fire. They were cut down as soon as they left their landing craft. On White Beach, John Foote continued his work throughout the morning. As the tide went out, the regimental aid post had to be moved. Foote and Captain Clare relocated the aid post to the shelter of a stranded landing craft. The craft had been hit during the landing and was now grounded on the beach, but even this shelter proved dangerous when German shells set fire to ammunition stored inside the craft. Foote crawled into the burning landing craft to pull wounded men out before the ammunition exploded. Hour after hour, Foote continued his journeys across the exposed beach. He would inject morphine into wounded men, apply first aid, then carry them back to relative safety. Survivors later testified that Foote personally saved dozens of lives that day. But more importantly, his calm courage inspired everyone who saw him. Soldiers watching the chaplain walk through the fire found their own courage strengthened. If Padre Foote could walk calmly across that hell, then they could endure as well. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the order to evacuate was finally given. The raid had lasted less than 4 hours, and it had been a complete disaster. Landing craft began approaching the beach through smoke screens to pick up survivors. But the tide had gone out, leaving a wide expanse of exposed beach between the soldiers and the water. German machine gunners poured fire into the men trying to reach the landing craft. John Foote began carrying wounded men across the open beach to the landing craft. The journey was even more dangerous now because the distance was greater. Foote would lift a wounded soldier, carry him 200 yards across the fire-swept beach, and load him onto a landing craft. Then he would turn around and go back for another man. On several occasions, Foote had the opportunity to board a landing craft himself. The craft commanders called to him to get aboard, to save himself, but each time Foote refused. He would deliver the wounded man he was carrying, then turn back to the beach for another. His only concern was getting as many wounded men off the beach as possible. By mid-morning, the evacuation was winding down. Most of the landing craft that could reach the beach had already departed. German fire was too intense for more craft to risk approaching. Hundreds of Canadian soldiers were still on the beach, many wounded, all facing capture. One final landing craft made its approach to White Beach. John Foote helped load the last wounded men who could be moved. Then, as the craft prepared to pull away, Foote himself climbed aboard. He was finally leaving the beach after 8 hours of hell. The landing craft began reversing away from shore, engines straining. In a few more minutes, Foote would be clear of the beach and heading for the safety of the ships offshore. But then Foote looked back at the beach. He saw wounded men who could not be evacuated. He saw soldiers who would be taken prisoner within the hour. He saw his regiment, the men he had served with for 3 years, facing captivity. And John Foote made his decision. He climbed out of the landing craft and jumped back into the water. The crew called out to him, ordered him to get back aboard. But Foote waded back to shore without looking back. He walked deliberately back onto the beach where wounded soldiers lay waiting. He had chosen to stay with his men, chosen to share their fate as prisoners of war. The soldiers on the beach watched in disbelief. Padre Foote could have escaped, could have been safe. Instead, he deliberately walked back into German captivity. By 11 o'clock in the morning, the Dieppe raid was over. The last landing craft had withdrawn, and German soldiers moved onto the beach to round up prisoners. The beach was covered with dead and wounded Canadian soldiers. Destroyed landing craft lay scattered on the shingle. Burned-out Churchill tanks sat silent on the esplanade. Of the 4,963 Canadians who embarked for Dieppe, only 2,210 returned to England. 907 Canadian soldiers were killed. 586 were wounded. 1,946 were taken prisoner, including John Weir Foote. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry suffered 366 casualties out of 582 men. 63% of the regiment became casualties in less than 4 hours. German soldiers moved across the beach, separating the living from the dead. They herded the Canadian prisoners into groups and marched them into Dieppe. John Foote walked with his men, still wearing his chaplain's uniform with its distinctive cross. The Germans photographed the columns of prisoners marching through Dieppe's streets. Those photographs were published around the world, showing the scale of the Allied defeat. John Foote spent the next 2 years and 9 months as a prisoner of war. He was held in various German prison camps, continuing to serve as chaplain to his fellow prisoners. He conducted religious services, counseled men struggling with captivity, and maintained morale. The Geneva Convention stipulated that chaplains were non-combatants who should be repatriated, but the Germans often ignored this requirement, especially after large numbers of German prisoners had been captured. Foote remained imprisoned throughout the war, enduring the hardships of captivity with his men. In the spring of 1945, as Allied armies drove deep into Germany, the prison camps were liberated. John Foote was finally freed on May 5, 1945. It was his 41st birthday. Foote returned to England and then to Canada, where he was reunited with his wife Edith. Back in Canada, stories were circulating about a chaplain who had performed extraordinary acts of courage at Dieppe. Survivors of the raid told and retold the story of Padre Foote walking across the fire-swept beach. They described how he had carried wounded men to safety again and again, showing no fear. And they described the moment when Foote had climbed out of the last landing craft and chosen to stay behind. In June 1946, the London Gazette published John Foote's Victoria Cross citation. The citation read in part, "Upon landing on the beach under heavy fire, he attached himself to the regimental aid post. During the subsequent period of approximately 8 hours, while the action continued, this officer not only assisted the regimental medical officer, but time and again left this shelter to inject morphine, give first aid, and carry wounded personnel from the open beach to the regimental aid post." With utter disregard for his personal safety, Honorary Captain Foote exposed himself to an inferno of fire and saved many lives. On several occasions, this officer had the opportunity to embark, but returned to the beach as his chief concern was the care and evacuation of the wounded. He refused a final opportunity to leave the shore, choosing to suffer the fate of the men he had ministered to for over 3 years. Honorary Captain Foote personally saved many lives by his efforts, and his example inspired all around him. John Weir Foote became the first and only Canadian chaplain ever awarded the Victoria Cross. He was also only the second chaplain in the entire British Empire to receive the Victoria Cross during World War II. On March 28, 1946, John Foote traveled to Buckingham Palace in London. King George VI personally presented Foote with his Victoria Cross medal. Foote remained with the Canadian Chaplain Corps after the war. He was posted to Camp Borden in Ontario as senior Protestant chaplain, with the rank of major. He lived in Barrie, Ontario, at 135 Mulcaster Street. In 1948, Foote was demobilized from the Army as a lieutenant colonel. After 8 years of military service, John Foote returned to civilian life. But instead of returning to the Presbyterian ministry, Foote entered politics. In the 1948 Ontario provincial election, Foote ran as the Progressive Conservative candidate for Durham County. He won his seat and entered the Legislative Assembly of Ontario. Foote served as the member of provincial parliament for Durham from 1948 to 1959. In 1951, after the Progressive Conservatives won the provincial election, Foote was appointed to cabinet. Premier Leslie Frost named Foote as Ontario Minister of Reform Institutions. In this role, Foote was responsible for the province's correctional system and reform schools. Foote served as minister from 1951 to 1957. In 1957, Foote suffered the first of several heart attacks. He stepped down from the cabinet but continued to serve as an MPP. In 1959, Foote retired from politics after 11 years in the Ontario legislature. Foote and his wife Edith moved to Cobourg, Ontario, where they would live for the rest of their lives. But John Foote's connection with the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry was not finished. In 1964, Foote returned to the Rileys as honorary lieutenant colonel. This was a ceremonial position that recognized his long service with the regiment. Foote attended regimental functions, inspected troops, and maintained his connection with the regiment he loved. He served as honorary lieutenant colonel until 1973. In 1982, the Royal Canadian Legion branch in Grafton, Ontario was renamed in Foote's honor. It became Lieutenant Colonel John W. Foote VCCD Branch 580. Edith Foote died in 1986 at age 88, after 57 years of marriage. John Weir Foote died in Cobourg on May 2, 1988. He was 4 days short of his 84th birthday. Foote was buried in Union Cemetery in Cobourg beside his wife. Before his death, John Foote had donated his medals to the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry. They are now held at the RHLI Heritage Museum in Hamilton. In 1989, the James Street Armory in Hamilton was renamed in Foote's honor. It became the Lieutenant Colonel John Weir Foote VCCD Armory. The armory is home to the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry and other units. Plaques and memorials across Canada honor Foote's memory. In Madoc, Ontario, where Foote was born, a historical plaque stands in Thomas Thompson Memorial Park. In Barrie, Ontario, where Foote lived after the war, another plaque commemorates him. In Calgary's Victoria Cross Park, a plaque honors all Canadian Victoria Cross recipients, including Foote. So, what can we learn from John Weir Foote's story? What does his life tell us about courage, compassion, and sacrifice? First, Foote's story shows that courage comes in many forms. Foote was not a combat soldier. He carried no weapons, he killed no enemy. But his courage was no less real than that of the soldiers fighting around him. Walking unarmed across a fire-swept beach to save wounded men required extraordinary bravery. Foote's courage was the courage of compassion, the courage to serve others regardless of personal risk. Second, Foote's story illustrates the power of moral example. Survivors testified that watching Foote walk calmly through the German fire strengthened their own courage. His example inspired soldiers who were terrified and demoralized. Sometimes the most important contribution in a crisis is simply showing others that courage is possible. Third, Foote's decision to stay behind reveals a profound understanding of duty. He could have justified leaving. He had done everything possible, saved dozens of lives. But Foote understood that his duty as chaplain did not end when the evacuation ended. The wounded soldiers who could not be evacuated would need spiritual comfort in the days ahead. The soldiers facing captivity would need a chaplain to maintain their morale. Foote chose duty over safety, chose to stay with his men regardless of the personal cost. Fourth, Foote's story shows the difference between heroism and foolishness. Some might argue that Foote's decision to stay was wasteful, that he should have saved himself. But the soldiers who endured captivity with Foote disagreed. They testified that Foote's presence in the prison camps was invaluable. He conducted services, counseled men struggling with captivity, and maintained hope. Foote's decision to stay was not foolish. It was a calculated choice to continue serving where he was most needed. Fifth, Foote's later career shows that heroism does not end with the war. After returning from captivity, Foote could have retired on his Victoria Cross laurels. Instead, he entered politics and served his province as Minister of Reform Institutions. He brought the same dedication to civilian service that he had shown in military service. True heroism is not a single act, but a lifetime pattern of service. Finally, Foote's story reminds us that compassion can survive even in the worst circumstances. Dieppe Beach was hell on earth, hundreds of men dying in a few hours. In that environment, it would have been easy to lose all sense of humanity. But John Foote walked through that hell showing nothing but compassion for wounded soldiers. He risked his life again and again, not to kill the enemy but to save his comrades. That morning on the beaches of Dieppe, Honorary Captain John Weir Foote faced a choice. The last landing craft was pulling away, he was aboard, and safety was minutes away. But wounded men remained on the beach, soldiers who would need care in captivity. Foote looked back at the beach and understood what his duty required. He could have escaped. He stayed. He climbed out of the landing craft and waded back to shore. He walked deliberately back onto that hell of a beach to share his men's fate. He spent the next 2 years and 9 months as a prisoner of war, ministering to his fellow captives. And when the war ended, when he was finally free, John Foote never spoke of regrets. He had made the right choice on Dieppe Beach. Honorary Captain John Weir Foote, VCCD, was 83 years old when he died. He was a Presbyterian minister who answered his nation's call in wartime. He was a chaplain who walked unarmed through machine gun fire to save wounded soldiers. He was a man who chose captivity over freedom, so he could serve those who needed him. And he was the only Canadian chaplain ever awarded the Victoria Cross. In Hamilton, Ontario, an armory still bears his name. In Cobourg, Ontario, he rests beside his wife in Union Cemetery. And every year on August 19th, people gather to remember Dieppe. They remember the worst raid in Canadian military history. They remember the beaches covered with dead and wounded. They remember the soldiers who never came home. And they remember the chaplain who walked through fire to save the wounded. They remember the man who climbed out of the last landing craft. They remember compassion in the midst of catastrophe. He could have escaped. He stayed. Those 5 words capture everything about John Foote's character. Not that he survived when others died, though he did. Not that he showed extraordinary courage, though he did. But that when offered salvation, when escape was within reach, he chose to stay with his men. Because duty mattered. Because compassion mattered. Because serving others mattered more than saving himself. That is the legacy of Honorary Captain John Weir Foote, VCCD.